Number 1. The Sack of Merv. Picture one of the largest cities on Earth. Then picture it gone within a single season. This is Merv, an oasis metropolis on the Murghab River in what is now Turkmenistan. In the early 13th century, it was a jewel of the Silk Road, part of the powerful Khwarezmian Empire, swollen with merchants, scholars, and refugees fleeing the storm gathering to the east. That storm was the Mongols. In February of 1221 CE, an army under Tolui, the youngest son of Genghis Khan, arrived at the city walls. The governor, Mujir al-Mulk, chose to surrender, trusting Mongol promises of mercy. It was a fatal mistake. Our main source is the Persian historian Juvaini, who wrote his History of the World Conqueror a generation later. He describes the population being marched out onto the open plain and divided among the soldiers for execution. Each Mongol warrior, he claims, was given a quota of several hundred people to kill. The numbers he records are staggering, somewhere between 700,000 and well over 1 million dead. The slaughter, he says, took days. Modern historians like John Mann and Timothy May treat these medieval tolls as exaggerations, but they accept the core truth. The city was emptied of life. What makes Merv so chilling is that the Mongols did not simply kill. They engineered the future. They destroyed the great dam on the Murghab River that fed the city's irrigation. Without water, the oasis could never again support a large population. The land itself was disarmed. Skilled artisans were spared, but only to be deported east as tools of the war machine. And when survivors crept out of hiding after the army moved on, a second sweep hunted them down. This was part of a wider campaign that devoured Bukhara, Samarkand, and Nishapur, where the Mongols reportedly built pyramids of skulls. The killing at Nishapur was said to be revenge for the death of one of Genghis Khan's sons-in-law in the fighting. The Khwarezmian Empire, one of the great powers of the age, simply ceased to exist within about 2 years. The trigger had been almost petty: the massacre of a Mongol trade caravan at the town of Otrar by a local governor. Today, the ruins of Merv are a vast and silent archaeological site, named a World Heritage Location in 1999. It is really several superimposed cities layered on top of one another, with names like Urk Kala and Sultan Kala. Amid the rubble, one structure survived: the Great Mausoleum of Sultan Sanjar, with its massive turquoise dome, a lonely monument to everything that was lost. Merv had once been a renowned center of Islamic learning, its libraries linked to scholars like the poet and astronomer Omar Khayyam. One question follows us forward. Was this blind vengeance or a cold and deliberate policy of erasure? Number 2. The Destruction of Susa. To find erasure written down as official policy, we travel back nearly 2,000 years before Merv to the ancient Near East. Susa was the capital of Elam, one of the oldest civilizations on the planet, with roots reaching into the 4th millennium BC. For more than 2,000 years, Elam was a rival and sometimes a master of Mesopotamia. Then, it met the Neo-Assyrian Empire at its terrifying peak, under King Ashurbanipal, who ruled from around 669 to 631 BC. Around 647 BC, after long and bitter wars, Ashurbanipal sacked Susa. We know exactly what he did because he bragged about it in carved stone. His royal annals describe the destruction in language designed to terrify. He records leveling the great ziggurat of Susa and carrying off the shining bronze horns that crowned it. He describes smashing open the royal tombs of Elam and carrying the bones of long-dead kings back to Assyria, denying the dead their eternal rest. Then comes the detail that echoes through history. Ashurbanipal claims he sowed the fields of Elam with salt and with a thorny plant so that nothing would grow. He boasts that he removed from the land the voice of mankind, the tread of cattle and sheep, and the sound of joyful song. Sacred groves were cut down. The temple of the great god in Shushinak was desecrated, and the statues of the Elamite gods were carried off, stripping the people of their divine protection. This was not warfare for territory. This was annihilation as performance, what scholars call Assyrian frightfulness, calculated terror used as a tool of empire. Elam never again rose as an independent power. The site was eventually resettled, and centuries later, Susa became a glittering capital of the Persian king Darius I. French archaeologist Jacques de Morgan began excavating there in 1897, and it was at Susa that the famous Code of Hammurabi was found, itself war loot dragged there long before. The Elamite language was a true isolate, related to nothing else we know, so its loss was the loss of an entire way of seeing the world. And yet, remember this. Within only a few decades, mighty Assyria itself would be wiped from the map. Number 3. The Obliteration of Babylon. Ashurbanipal's grandfather set an even more extreme example. His name was Sennacherib, king of Assyria, from 705 to 681 BC. His enemy was not some obscure rival. It was Babylon itself, the most ancient and sacred city in all of Mesopotamia, a place revered even by the Assyrians who ruled it. Babylon, however, would not stay quiet. Again and again it rebelled, backed by Chaldeans and Elamites. The breaking point came when Sennacherib's own son, whom he had installed as king of Babylon, was captured by the Elamites and never seen again. In 689 BC, after a long siege, Sennacherib took the city and ordered something almost unthinkable. He decided to erase Babylon from existence. His annals describe tearing down the walls, the temples, and the ziggurats, and dumping the rubble into the canal. Then he did something that stunned the ancient world. He diverted the waters of the Euphrates and channeled them over the ruins, turning the greatest city of its age into a flooded marsh. He stated his goal plainly. Future generations should not even be able to recognize the site of the city or its temples. He also carried off the statue of Marduk, Babylon's chief god. This was more than theft. In Mesopotamian belief, the presence of Marduk legitimized kingship itself. To remove him was to unmake the city's very soul. The destruction was so shocking, so impious, that it haunted Sennacherib's reputation. When he was assassinated by his own sons in 681 BC, later tradition framed it as divine punishment for drowning the holy city. And here's the twist that separates Babylon from Susa. Sennacherib's son and successor, Esarhaddon, completely reversed course. He rebuilt Babylon and returned the statue of Marduk, presenting himself as the city's savior. Babylon did not stay dead. It rose again, and a century later, under Nebuchadnezzar II, it reached its greatest glory, with the dazzling Ishtar Gate and the towering ziggurat called Etemenanki. We know these events from clay prisms, like the Taylor Prism, now treasured in museums. So why do some erased cities claw their way back, while others vanish forever? Hold that question. The next city never came back at all. Number 4. The Burning of Ugarit. On the coast of northern Syria once stood a kingdom so completely destroyed that its very name was forgotten for 3,000 years. This was Ugarit, a wealthy port at the site now called Ras Shamra. In the late Bronze Age, it was a glittering hub of international trade, dealing copper, tin, textiles, and luxuries with Egypt, the Hittites, Cyprus, and the Mycenaean Greeks. It was a vassal of the Hittite Empire, yet rich and sophisticated in its own right, with a royal palace of around 90 rooms and multiple archives. Ugarit was rediscovered by accident in 1928 when a farmer's plow struck an ancient tomb. The French archaeologist Claude Schaeffer began digging the next year, and what he found was extraordinary. Ugarit had given the world one of the earliest alphabets, a cuneiform script of about 30 signs. Its clay tablets preserved Canaanite myths like the Baal cycle, texts that illuminate the religious world that would later shape the Bible. But the most haunting discoveries were the letters from the kingdom's final days. One tablet, often called the Last Letter, was written by King Amurapi to the King of Cyprus. In it, he reports that enemy ships have appeared and are burning his towns, and he begs for help. Another text notes that the kingdom's own army and fleet were away in Hittite lands, leaving the coast undefended. And in the ruins, archaeologists found a clay tablet still sitting in the kiln, apparently being baked at the very moment the city fell. Life was interrupted mid-sentence. The destroyers are traditionally identified with the mysterious Sea Peoples, a coalition of seafaring raiders. Egyptian records from the reign of Ramesses III, carved at Medinet Habu around 1177 BC, describe a great battle against these invaders and name groups like the Peliset and the Shekelesh. But the Sea Peoples were only one part of a much larger catastrophe, the Late Bronze Age collapse, which toppled civilizations across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC. Scientists studying pollen cores from the Sea of Galilee have found evidence of a severe, decades-long drought in exactly this period. Famine, earthquakes, the breakdown of trade, and invasion all struck at once. Ugarit burned and was never reoccupied, which is precisely why it gives us such a perfect frozen snapshot. And that same wave of destruction was already reaching a far greater capital, inland and in the mountains. Number 5. The Fall of Hattusa. That capital was Hattusa, the seat of the Hittite Empire, near the modern Turkish village of Boğazkale. The Hittites were not a minor people. They were a superpower, the great rival of Egypt. When their king fought Ramesses II to a standstill at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BC, the result was the world's first known peace treaty. Hittite kings wrote to the pharaohs as equals. And yet, for thousands of years, this empire was almost entirely forgotten, surviving only as a few puzzling references to the Hittites in the Bible. Then, in 1834, the French traveler Charles Texier stumbled upon vast ruins in central Anatolia. German excavations beginning in 1906 uncovered the truth. The royal archives held roughly 30,000 cuneiform tablets. From them, scholars recovered an entire lost history, and the linguist Bedjik Hrozny stunned the world in 1915 by proving that the Hittite language was Indo-European, related to Greek, Latin, and English. The city itself was monumental, ringed by kilometers of walls and guarded by carved gateways, the Lion Gate, the King's Gate, and the Sphinx Gate. Nearby, at the rock sanctuary of Yazilikaya, the entire Hittite pantheon marches in carved procession. Around 1200 BC, Hattusa burned and the empire collapsed. For a long time, the story was simple. The city was sacked and destroyed in a violent end. But recent archaeology, led by researchers like Andreas Schachner, has complicated that picture. The evidence suggests that valuables and the royal archives were carefully removed before the final fire. This points to an organized abandonment, a court that packed up and left, rather than a city caught by surprise. So who, or what, finished Hattusa off? The candidates include the Kaska tribes, longtime northern enemies of the Hittites, the Sea Peoples, internal rebellion, and above all, famine. One desperate late letter from a Hittite king begs for grain shipments, calling it a matter of life and death. After the fall, the empire fragmented into small Neo-Hittite states, surviving for a while in the south at places like Carchemish. The last great king, Suppiluliuma II, presided over the final crisis. The Hittites had been pioneers of ironworking, sometimes counted among the earliest masters of the metal, and yet even that technological edge could not save them. Hattusa was finally recognized as a World Heritage Site in 1986. Here we see a new and unsettling kind of erasure, not just a city wiped from the map, but an entire civilization wiped from human memory, until the spade and the tablet brought it back. Now, let us leave the old world entirely. Number 6. The Defeat of Tikal. Deep in the rainforest of northern Guatemala rise the limestone temple pyramids of Tikal, one of the mightiest of all Maya city-states. Its greatest pyramid, the Temple of the Great Jaguar, climbs about 47 meters above the jungle canopy. To the Maya, this place was called Mutal. For centuries, it dominated the lowlands. And then, around 562 CE, it was brought crashing down in a single catastrophic war. Mayanists have a striking name for this kind of event. They call it a Star War because the inscriptions tie these conflicts to the movements of the planet Venus. The victor over Tikal was its great rival, Calakmul, known as the Snake Kingdom, working with its ally, Karakol, in what is now Belize. Inscriptions carved at Karakol record the triumph of 562 CE. Tikal's king, Wak Chan Kawil, appears to have been captured and, in the Maya custom, sacrificed. The consequences were profound. Tikal entered what scholars call the hiatus, a period of roughly 130 years, during which the city erected almost no dated monuments. For a Maya city-state, that silence is the signature of political collapse. Calakmul had built a vast web of alliances to encircle and strangle its rival. This was a Maya superpower struggle, every bit as strategic as anything in the Old World. How could we possibly know the details of a war fought 15 centuries ago in the jungle? The answer is one of the great triumphs of modern scholarship, the decipherment of Maya glyphs. Pioneers like Tatiana Proskuryakov first realized that the inscriptions recorded real history, real kings, real battles. Researchers like Simon Martin and Nikolai Gruba then reconstructed these dynastic wars almost like a soap opera of warring houses. We learned that Maya warfare often aimed not at seizing land, but at capturing a rival king for ritual sacrifice. And these Star Wars were deliberately timed to astronomical events, fusing astronomy, the calendar, and statecraft into one. Tikal's story did not end in defeat. In 695 CE, a new king, Jasaw Chan Kawil I, crushed Calakmul and launched a glorious revival. The city you can visit today, made famous as a rebel base in the original Star Wars film, is largely his work. Recent LiDAR surveys, which use lasers to see through the forest, have revealed that the Maya world was far more densely populated than anyone imagined. So the erasure here was cultural silence, not rubble. Next, the most literal single day of all. Number 7. The Razing of Thebes. In ancient Greece, few cities were prouder than Thebes. Under the brilliant general Epaminondas, Thebes had shattered the legend of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC. Its elite fighting unit, the Sacred Band, was famous across the Greek world. But in 335 BC, Thebes made a catastrophic gamble, and it cost the city its entire existence in a single day. The story begins with a rumor. Philip II of Macedon had been assassinated, and his young son Alexander had inherited the throne and the rule over Greece. While Alexander was campaigning far to the north, a false report spread that he had been killed. Thebes seized the moment and revolted, trapping the Macedonian garrison inside the city's citadel. It was exactly the wrong bet. Alexander was very much alive, and he marched south with such terrifying speed that he stood before the walls of Thebes before most Greeks even believed he was coming. The assault was swift and total. The city fell in a single day of fighting. Our sources, the historians Arrian, Diodorus Siculus, and Plutarch, record around 6,000 Thebans killed and some 30,000 sold into slavery. Crucially, Alexander led a council of his Greek allies decide the city's fate. These allies, old enemies of Thebes, voted for destruction. The city was leveled almost to the ground. In one famous gesture, Alexander ordered that the temples be spared, and along with them the house of the great poet Pindar, a striking act of reverence amid the carnage. This was terror with a strategic purpose. Alexander was about to march east to conquer the Persian Empire, and he could not leave a rebellious Greece at his back. The destruction of Thebes was a message, and it worked. Greece stayed quiet for the entire decade of his Asian campaigns. Thebes had been a city of myth, the home of Oedipus and the legendary founder Cadmus, who supposedly sowed dragon's teeth that sprang up as warriors. Now it was ash. The city was partly refounded years later by Cassander, but it never recovered its power. Once again, we see the pattern. Erasure used, deliberately, as a warning carved into the memory of everyone watching. Now we cross an ocean and 1,000 years to the most lopsided battle of them all. Number 8. The Battle of Cajamarca. On the 16th of November, 1532 CE, in the highlands of northern Peru, fewer than 200 Spaniards destroyed the largest empire in the Americas in the span of a single afternoon. The empire was the Inca, or Tawantinsuyu, stretching down the spine of the Andes. The Spanish force, led by Francisco Pizarro, numbered only about 168 men, with around 62 horsemen and a few small cannon. Against them stood the Inca emperor Atahualpa, surrounded by thousands of attendants, with a massive army camped nearby. Atahualpa had every advantage of numbers, but he was walking into a trap. He had just won a brutal civil war against his half-brother, leaving his empire freshly divided and exhausted. When he entered the central plaza of Cajamarca, a Spanish friar named Vicente de Valverde approached him, presented a Bible, and demanded submission to a foreign king and God. Atahualpa, baffled, examined the book and threw it down. That was the signal. Pizarro ordered the attack. What followed was not a battle, but a massacre. Cannon fire and gunshots erupted in the enclosed square. Spanish cavalry, mounted on animals the Inca had never seen, charged into a crowd of largely unarmed attendants. Thousands were cut down in a matter of hours. The Spanish suffered essentially no combat deaths. Their steel swords and armor, their horses, their firearms, and the sheer shock of the ambush created an overwhelming advantage in that confined space. But the decisive act was not the killing, it was the capture. Pizarro took Atahualpa alive. In a centralized, semi-divine empire like the Inca, the emperor was the state. With him a prisoner, the entire system was paralyzed. Atahualpa understood the value of gold to his captors and offered a legendary ransom. He would fill a large room once with gold and twice with silver. The treasure was gathered, an astonishing fortune. And then the Spanish executed him anyway, in July of 1533 CE, after a sham trial. We know these events from eyewitnesses like Pizarro's secretary, Francisco de Xerez. The capital, Cusco, fell soon after. There is a deeper lesson here, made famous by the scientist Jared Diamond. Steel and horses mattered, and disease mattered even more, for smallpox had raced ahead of the Spanish and helped spark that fatal civil war. But above all, it was the fragile, centralized structure of the empire that let a single afternoon undo it. Number 9. The Sack of Baghdad. Some battles erase a city. This one erased a golden age. For roughly 5 centuries, Baghdad had been the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate and the intellectual heart of the Islamic world. It was a place of libraries, observatories, hospitals, and scholars who preserved and expanded the knowledge of the ancient world. In 1258 CE, the Mongols came for it. The army was led by Hulagu Khan, a grandson of Genghis Khan, and it was enormous. The siege began in January, and the city fell on the 10th of February, 1258 CE. The last Abbasid caliph, Al-Mustasim, had badly misjudged the threat, refusing Mongol demands for submission while failing to prepare a real defense. When the city fell, the caliph was captured. According to the most famous account, the Mongols, unwilling to spill royal blood on the ground, rolled him in a carpet, and trampled him to death beneath their horses. The destruction that followed became legendary. Estimates of the dead range wildly, from around 90,000 to figures approaching 1,000,000, numbers we cannot verify, but which speak to the scale of horror. The greatest loss, the one history remembers most bitterly, was the destruction of the city's libraries, including the famed House of Wisdom. Tradition holds that so many books were thrown into the Tigris River that its waters ran black with the ink of countless manuscripts. Other accounts say the river ran red with blood. Both images survive together. Centuries of work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy were lost or scattered in a matter of days. Not everything was destroyed. The brilliant Persian astronomer Nasir al-Din al-Tusi survived and later built a great observatory at Maragay under Mongol patronage, a reminder that knowledge persisted even as its old home burned. The Mongol advance was finally halted 2 years later, in 1260 CE, when the Egyptian Mamluks defeated them at the Battle of Ain Jalut. Hulagu went on to found the Ilkhanate, a Mongol kingdom ruling Persia. But Baghdad never reclaimed its place as the world's preeminent center of learning. The sack is remembered as the symbolic end of the Islamic Golden Age and as one of history's most devastating losses of irreplaceable knowledge. Our final battle is the one that gave us the very phrase for total destruction. Number 10. The Destruction of Carthage. Across the Mediterranean from Rome lay Carthage, a Phoenician-founded superpower that for centuries dominated the Western seas. Rome and Carthage fought 3 long wars, the Punic Wars, for mastery of the Mediterranean world. The second of these produced one of history's greatest generals, Hannibal, who crossed the Alps with war elephants and annihilated Roman armies at Cannae in 216 BC. Yet Rome endured and finally won that war at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. By the time of the Third Punic War, Carthage was militarily broken but commercially reviving, and that recovery terrified Rome's hardliners. The Senator Cato the Elder is said to have ended every speech on any subject with the same words: Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BC, Rome laid siege. Astonishingly, the weakened city held out for 3 years. The final assault came in the spring of 146 BC, led by the general Scipio Aemilianus. The fighting was savage and intimate. Roman legionaries had to battle street by street, house by house, up the slopes toward the citadel of Byrsa, a struggle that lasted around 6 days. When it was over, the city was put to the torch and burned for days. From a population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The historian Polybius, a friend of Scipio, witnessed the destruction. He records that Scipio wept as he watched Carthage burn, quoting Homer and reflecting that one day Rome itself would surely fall in the same way. You may have heard that the Romans sowed the ruins with salt so nothing would ever grow there. It is a powerful image, but it is a much later invention, with no basis in the ancient sources. The physical destruction, however, was entirely real. Carthage as a sovereign civilization simply ended. Its language, its gods like Baal-Hamon and Tanit, its whole culture were extinguished. The territory became the Roman province of Africa, and the very same year, Rome also destroyed the Greek city of Corinth, announcing itself as the unrivaled master of the Mediterranean. Because Punic literature was almost entirely lost, we see Carthage today mostly through the eyes of the people who killed it. Scipio's tears point to something larger, a pattern hiding inside all 10 of these stories. What turns an ordinary defeat into the extinction of a civilization? Looking across these 10 days, the same brutal mechanisms appear again and again. The first is the vulnerability of centralized power. When a society pours all authority into a single divine ruler, capturing or killing that one person can paralyze everything. We see it with Atahualpa in his plaza, with the caliph rolled in his carpet, and with the Maya king Wakchan Kowil dragged off to sacrifice. Cut the head, and the body dies. The second mechanism is attacking the land itself. The Mongols destroyed the irrigation dam at Merv, knowing that without water, the oasis could never recover. Sennacherib flooded Babylon, and Ashurbanipal salted the fields of Elam. These are not acts of battlefield rage. They are deliberate strategies to lower the carrying capacity of a place so that life cannot return. The third mechanism is removing the people, deporting artisans, enslaving survivors, marching the population away. A city is its people, and Thebes, Carthage, and Merv all lost the human capital needed to rebuild. The fourth mechanism is killing memory, burning the libraries of Baghdad, erasing Punic literature, smashing the temples, and carrying off the gods. When you destroy the records and the priests and the scholars, you destroy a civilization's ability to remember itself. And the fifth is terror as policy. Alexander leveled Thebes as a message to all of Greece. The Assyrians turned destruction into theater precisely so that others would surrender without a fight. Timing mattered too. The deadliest blows fell on societies already divided or weakened. The Inca in their civil war, Babylon in its endless revolts, the Bronze Age world buckling under drought and famine. And yet, there is a crucial variable that decides whether a city stays dead: cultural prestige and a surviving population. Babylon and Carthage and Susa all rose again in some form because the idea of them and enough people endured. Ugarit and the imperial Merv did not. The cruelest irony of all runs underneath every story. The destroyers never last either. So how much have we simply lost forever, with no scribe left to tell us? It is worth pausing on a strange and wonderful question. How do we know any of this? How can we describe a single day of fighting from 3,000 years ago? The answer lies in a patient detective science built from clay, ash, and stone. The most direct evidence is the destruction layer, the band of ash, collapsed walls, and scattered arrowheads that archaeologists find when a city burns. At Ugarit and Hattusa, these layers freeze the moment of catastrophe. And there is a strange paradox here. Total destruction can preserve a perfect snapshot. The tablet still sitting in the kiln at Ugarit survived precisely because the city died around it. Then there are the written boasts of the victors. The Assyrian kings carved their atrocities into clay prisms and palace walls, giving us astonishingly detailed, if proud and exaggerated, accounts. But this introduces a deep bias. We hear the destroyers loud and clear, while the voices of the destroyed, the Elamites, the Carthaginians, fall almost silent. History, quite literally, is written by the survivors. Some of the greatest breakthroughs came from cracking lost languages and scripts. Bedjik Hrozny deciphered Hittite and restored an empire. Tatiana Proskoryakov realized that Maya glyphs recorded real kings and real wars, opening the entire political history of the Maya. Much of this evidence now sits far from where it was made. The Assyrian battle reliefs of Tiltuba are in the British Museum in London, and the Code of Hammurabi, looted to Susa in antiquity and dug up there, stands today in the Louvre in Paris. The objects themselves carry the history of their own capture. New witnesses keep arriving. Climate scientists now read drought out of pollen cores and chemical isotopes, confirming the famines behind the Bronze Age collapse. LiDAR lasers strip away the jungle to reveal that Tikal and its neighbors were vast, crowded landscapes. Historians cross-check Egyptian carvings against Levantine ash layers, and trust eyewitness chains like Polybius at Carthage or Xerxes at Cajamarca. They even learn to test the wild death tolls of medieval chroniclers. Sometimes the absence of evidence is the evidence. The silence of Tikal's hiatus, the empty rooms of Hattusa, speak as loudly as any inscription. But the records that survive are only a fraction of what once existed, which leads to a haunting thought. For every civilization in this video, there are others we can barely glimpse or cannot reach at all. The Elamites left a language that is a true isolate, related to nothing. So even when we read their words, we struggle to fully enter their world. The Carthaginians left almost no literature of their own, so an entire Mediterranean civilization survives mostly as a villain in Roman stories. And the Sea Peoples, the very force that helped topple Ugarit and shake Hattusa, remains so mysterious that we still cannot say for certain who they were or where they came from. Across Central Asia and the Near East, countless ancient settlement mounds, called tells, have never been excavated. Some of them are surely other Mervs, other lost capitals whose names we do not yet know. In the Americas, many civilizations recorded their world through oral tradition or through systems like the Inca knotted cords, the quipu, which we are only beginning to understand. When those societies were shattered, much of their knowledge had no durable form to survive in. There is also the simple bias of survival. We remember the cities that were rebuilt, the Babylons and the Carthages that came back in some form. Carthage itself was eventually refounded as a Roman colony and grew into one of the largest cities of the empire, its Punic past paved over. The cities that stayed buried, by contrast, slip out of the story entirely, remembered by no one. And we must sit with the ethical weight of telling these tales largely through the words of the conquerors. Yet, there is real hope in this. Ugarit and Hattusa were both completely forgotten, and both were restored to us within the last 2 centuries by patient excavation and brilliant decipherment. The work is not finished. Somewhere, the next dig or the next cracked script may resurrect a people we never knew we had lost. Remember Scipio, weeping as Carthage burned, certain that Rome too would one day fall. That instinct points to the most consistent pattern in this entire story. The destroyers are always destroyed in their turn. Assyria, the empire that perfected terror at Susa and Babylon, was itself wiped out when its capital Nineveh fell in 612 BC, so thoroughly that for centuries people doubted it had ever existed. Sennacherib, who drowned Babylon, was murdered by his own sons. The Mongols, who seemed unstoppable as they crushed Merv and Baghdad, were finally halted at Ain Jalut in 1260 CE, proving there were limits even to them. Alexander, who erased Thebes, built the largest empire the world had seen, and it shattered into warring fragments within a few years of his death in 323 BC. Even the Maya Victor Calakmul was eventually eclipsed as Tikal rose again, and Rome, whose general foresaw its fall through his tears, did fall, centuries later, exactly as Polybius had mused. This is the cycle the ancient historians themselves recognized, the rise and fall of powers turning like a wheel. It is more than a poetic idea. These events left fingerprints on later thought, from the phrase a Carthaginian peace, meaning a settlement so harsh it destroys the loser, to our modern conviction that destroying cultural heritage is a war crime, now enshrined in international agreements. The Bronze Age collapse, in which interconnected civilizations fell almost like dominoes, is studied today as a warning about the fragility of complex, tightly linked societies, a warning that feels uncomfortably relevant to our own networked world. The single point of failure, the over-centralized system, remains a genuine vulnerability. Which raises the final question: what truly makes the difference between a civilization that ends and one that endures? The deepest lesson of these 10 battles is in asymmetry. It takes centuries, sometimes millennia, to build a civilization, its cities, its language, its accumulated knowledge, and it can take a single day to erase it. That imbalance is terrifying, and it is real. A dam broken, a library burned, a king captured, and the work of countless generations can vanish into ash and silence. And yet, look closer. and you find that erasure is almost never truly complete. A tablet survives in a kiln. A boastful inscription preserves the name of the people it describes destroying. A buried gate waits under a Turkish hillside for 3,000 years until someone comes to dig. The act of excavation, of decipherment, of patient scholarship is a kind of resurrection. We pulled Hattusa and Ugarit back out of total oblivion. We learned to read the wars of the Maya from carvings in the jungle. This tells us where the final battle is really fought. Not in the plaza or at the city wall, but in memory. A civilization is only truly dead when it is completely forgotten, and these 10 reverberate across the centuries precisely because we refuse to let that happen. Every name we recover, every story we tell, is a small reversal of what the conquerors intended. You, listening now, are part of that. By understanding Merv and Susa and Ugarit and the rest, you keep them from the second and final death of being forgotten. No power in any of these stories proved permanent. Not the Assyrians, not the Mongols, not Rome. But the memory of those they tried to erase has, against all odds, outlived them all. And that is why the most powerful thing we can do, standing in the silent ruins of a vanished world, is simply to remember it, and to say its name out loud.